To be sure.
Exactly.
Good morning and welcome to the encounter. For more than 10 years, Archbishop Silvano Maria Tomasi has served as permanent observer to the Office of the United Nations and specialized agencies in Geneva, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, where he has also been Archbishop and Nuncio, after serving in Djibouti. Until his appointment to these posts, Archbishop Tomasi served as Secretary of the Pontifical Council for Pastoral Care of Migrants and Itinerant Peoples. Additionally, he co-founded the Center for Migration Studies. Archbishop Tomasi obtained his PhD in sociology from Fordham University. Next to the Archbishop is Sarah Sievers. She is the Associate Dean of Policy and Practice at the University of Notre Dame's New Kellogg School of Global Affairs. Formerly Senior Director at Columbia University's Earth Institute, she has extensive experience in advocacy, policy, and governance of Nigeria in a Nigerian project that she implemented, New Development Goals. Sievers has local global health and advocacy efforts and has worked with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, served in the Foreign Service, and is the founding executive director of Harvard University's Center for Global Development and the Earth Institute's Center for Globalization and Development. She holds an MBA from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And finally, Chris Barrett. Chris Barrett is an agricultural and development economist. He is a professor of applied economics and management at the Charles H. Dyson School for Applied Economics and Management, as well as a professor in the development economics at Cornell University. He has over 300 publications, and his research has been cited more than 29,000 times. He served as editor of American Journal of Agricultural Economics. He sits on a variety of boards and panels, and he has won numerous university, national, international awards for teaching, research, and public outreach, and is an elected fellow of American Association for the Advancements of Science and the Agriculture Applied Economics Association, as well as the African Association for Agricultural Economics. The full biography of all three of our distinguished speakers is in both your program and on the New York Encounter website. Archbishop Tomasi.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
The task of our panel, and at least from what I understand, is to try to put the economy in relation to the human person, and to see the function of the economy not as dominating the activity of the human person or the human community, but to be at the service. I am going to try to say a few words on the basis of this little reasoning. First, as we look around and talk about the economy, we are not talking of a technical dimension of knowledge, but we talk about human beings, because the economy affects directly persons and communities. And since there are problems as we look at the reality of the human family affected by the economy, then we need to do something about. And what is the way to resolve the problems that we see? My view is that we need to aim at integral human development, and through that road we will understand how the economy should function. As we analyze a little bit the situation today, we see that there are quite a few problems. First of all, there is an imbalance in the situation around the world. If we consider that today 8 persons possess $426 billion, the same amount of wealth of the poorest half of our planet, namely of 3.6 billion people. 8 people and 3.6 billion people. They have the same amount of control on the wealth of this world. Another interesting conclusion that has been brought forth by the report World Wealth and Income Database of last December, so not very long ago, of the UN and of the World Bank. It was a joint research and effort. The conclusion is the income inequality grows in both developed and developing countries. Money and lack of money has consequences that are very practical for the lives of people. Another aspect in this increasing gap between the have and the have-nots is the fact that in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, the growth of income has been 3 times less than in the rest of the world. So I just refer to some of these notes of these examples because technical people can come up with a lot more information in this direction. But the first conclusion is, as we look at the human family, there are growing gaps between groups and between categories of people. So how do we respond to this situation? How can we change the economy so that it will be a resource for everyone? It's not the people, the persons, that are a resource for the economy, but the economy should be a resource for the people. The way to begin the search for a solution is to understand what we want to achieve. And what we want to achieve is a type of development that is not just technical or economic or material, but that is integral human development, as Pope Francis constantly repeats. And we need to humanize the economy. Among other things, the latest information is that there are still 850 million people who are hungry. The famine is still a reality. So integral human development demands that we analyze a bit what we understand by this expression that is used by everyone now. Is becoming more popular. Development has a different conceptualization that in turn lead to very different socioeconomic and political paths. For example, the conventional idea of development as economic growth, which can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution, is strongly based upon the acceleration and increase of the production processes. Despite its benefits on health, infrastructure, mobilization, and communications, among others, this model of development has also led in its way to an increasing level of inequality and serious environment damage. For these reasons, normative models of development appeared around the 1970s. Some of them were inspired by anti-capitalist human rights, the green and cultural movements, and so forth. The Church also drew the basis for an alternative development model based on its social tradition. And here you will remember Paul VI, Populorum Progressio, the encyclical on the progress of people and the development of people. Paul VI explained that development cannot be restricted to economic growth alone. To be authentic, development must be well-rounded. It must foster the development of each person and of the whole person, of each human group and of humanity as a whole. For this concept, integral human development is about being, about becoming more human. It's not primarily about having more things. For this concept, integral human development must be promoted and measured according to all dimensions of human existence. Economic, and for sure, but also political, cultural, ecological, spiritual, and so forth. This idea of development reasons with other alternative, relates to other alternative models of the time, such as those pioneered by some economists and some thinkers like Amartya Sen, and by the United Nations Development Program. It's an effort to have a more inclusive definition of development. These alternative and more holistic models of development still need, of course, an economic system that, while promoting economic growth, is still amenable to actual human progress, although it is not the task of the Church to indicate such a system. It is a responsibility to participate in the public arena so as to help correcting systems that hinder integral human development and integral human progress, and to help promoting systems that can truly serve humanity. This participation is a crucial dimension of the Church's prophetic mission in terms of development and justice. The current development economic model, as Pope Francis explains it, raises numerous questions about its integrality and authenticity. In fact, because it foments exclusion and inequality, as I mentioned some example before, it corrupts the social nature of our existence. Also being underpinned by the myth of individual autonomy, it belittles interpersonal bonds and the necessary communitarian dimension of human to flourish. The model is also inauthentic because it does not acknowledge the reality of the limits of prosperity. following uncritically the idols of money and the market, which is a false god, rule rather than serve humanity. The current economic model is complicit in distorting the idea of the person created in the image and likeness of God. In summary, on this point, I would say that the quality of development embraces a more universal, a more comprehensive type of understanding of development. And unless we do it that way, we are not going to be successful in developing an economic system that is productive and fruitful for everyone. In this context, obviously the philosophical and the ethical approach is to keep the human person and the human community as the final objective, the final target to be served by the economy. Vatican Council II sees the human person as not as a resource for economic growth or production, rather, and I quote, as the human person is the source, the focus, and the aim of all economic and social life. So in this connection, there is an important element that comes into play, and that is work. Work and the economy are kind of the twin tracks on which the train of development moves. And since we were created with a vocation to work, work is not just a function for the economy, but it is the expression of the dignity and the creativity of the human person. We can see how a first clear challenge for an economy with a human face is to revisit the notion of work. An economy centered on people always wants to promote full employment because it aims at helping every person to deploy their own vocation. However, due to the ecological crisis, we can no longer do it in the same way as we tried in the past. Yet this is the case. Who is going to pay the cost of the transition towards sustainable work? And another question is, this cannot occur at the expenses of the workers. Besides, how to promote full employment in a global, hyper-technocratic society? There are new problems emerging in the area of work that affects the human person, especially the robotic approach to development and in artificial intelligence, all questions that need to be analyzed and taken into account in looking at the role of the economy vis-à-vis the human person. As these labor issues are recurrent challenges, and we don't have to assume that they are over, but today on top of them we have a novel dimension, as I mentioned, robotics and artificial intelligence and so forth. Besides the issue of work in relation to the economy and the fact that the person has to become the protagonist, you cannot have a solid economy without the respect of the person. And you cannot have true development without the person becoming the protagonist of development. Then we need to take into account also the ecology. Pope Francis in the encyclical Laudato Si has emphasized the concept of integral ecology. There is a parallel between integral development and integral ecology. Integral ecology means nature has to be respected, taken care, creation, but also the needs and the expectations of the human person. Social problems must be addressed by community networks and community conversion. We need to become conscious to change some of our attitudes in order to protect the common home that is the earth. As Pope Francis reminds us, it is not enough to think of different species merely as potential resources to be exploited, while overlooking the fact that they have value in themselves. Neither the human person nor creation itself are instrument or means to something else. They need to be taken into account for what they are. A strategy to study and to understand the role of work, the respect of creation in relation to the economy is that of a dialogue and a wise governance. I think I cannot emphasize enough the importance of dialogue for integral human development. First, because a dialogical approach is the one that can counter the attitude of dominion that is causing violence. Secondly, because an inclusive dialogue can counter the social exclusion that foments conflicts. And thirdly, because when we dialogue, we are forced to go beyond our self-interest, encountering the other and discovering the richness of what we have in common. In a dialogue, the other is not an enemy, but a partner, a neighbor. Dialogue indeed is a fundamental characteristic of the human person. An economy that has people at its center is an economy in constant dialogue, an economy based on dialogue. I am aware of the difficulties of dialogue, especially when it is not limited to superficial negotiations and when it addresses the structural causes of conflict. But it is precisely this dialogue through which we best deploy the idea of integral human development. To promote a human economy, we need to improve, and in some places change, the dialogue between owners of services and production of work and workers, whether unionized or not. We would also need to support the dialogue at the international level as the Agenda 2030 and to ensure that the weakest voices do not get silenced and that no one gets behind. Economic is not alien to this process and could help or hinder processes of dialogue worldwide. Another aspect we need is conversion, so as to promote integral human development, particularly through economics, is the element of time, to have a real change. Laudato Si explains that one of the roots of the problem of the current development model is rapidification. This means a path of development that prevents us from being attentive to the relationships that enable us to flourish as human beings, a speed of living and working that prevents us from being fully attentive to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. This is also connected to the prevailing short-term mentality, particularly dominant in business and politics, to the increasing patterns of consumption which foment a throwaway culture that hinders relationships and hurts the earth, and to the difficulty to integrate a spirituality of care into our lifestyle and ways of working. How to decelerate in business, in our consumption habits, how to work for the long term in all dimensions of existence. We definitely need a move to a long-term mentality where consumerism is not chief and where rapid material growth is not the only parameter to consider that a company is doing well. Including different human dimensions to the economic growth analysis is essential to promote an economy with human beings as its center. And in conclusion, I would like to sum up quickly these scattered thoughts in this way. The gap in the welfare of the human family calls for a change in the economic system. The way is to aim at integral human development. The means to pursue this human development are a correct understanding of work, of time, of integral ecology. Above all, that the human person in the image of God has to a unique dignity, and this unique dignity makes the person the protagonist of work and the center of all economic activity. The person in a relation or his relations with the whole human family. We are kind of hurt by an excessive ideology of individualism. The risk to exclude the openness to the community. And therefore, when we talk of the economy, we need to be aware of this dominant feature of our present culture and keep in mind that relating to others is an essential condition for becoming more human and for working in an economic context, for an economic system that looks not just at the interest of one individual in a selfish way, but is at the service of the entire community and what we, in the social doctrine of the Church, call the common good. Thanks.
Mrs. Sievers.
Thank you. Is my slide up? I have a PowerPoint presentation. Oops, okay. I'm not sure what they can, back. See, now I need back already. There we are. Thank you so much for having me here. It's really an honor. It's an honor and privilege to be here, and also intimidating, I will say. Until about a year and a half ago, I thought the term integral human development was a grammar mistake. And the human person, what other kind of person would there be? You know, the friend, so these terms that we've put up here, here we are sitting next to, or here I am in the intimidating position of sitting next to the gentleman who defines many of these things. That I only met my second Catholic priest in my life after I started working at the University of Notre Dame about 2 years ago. So I'm a newcomer to many of these concepts. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. But once we got past some of the language, it was very interesting for me to realize how many of these concepts resonated far beyond the language with which they've been expressed. I'm from New England, and one of the things we do very well in New England is ask why. So automatically when I hear we have to have integral human development, it's very important for all these reasons. There's sort of a spiritual sense that responds yes, but then the New Englander in me says, why? There are lots of ways we could do this. Why integral human development at the core of all of this? And partly I think it's an important question to ask because the more explanation that we have, the more information we have to try to answer some of those questions, the more we can do with the resulting information. And partly, I think it's an important personal process to go through if these are concepts that we feel are sacred in some way. The process of reflection as we try to answer the why questions can sometimes yield to great personal growth as well and to some surprising results, as it has done in my case as I've been looking at this. So if I can now turn to the second slide. One of the questions that we are asked frequently is, should the strong protect the weak? And I thought I would sort of start by saying a lot of my background has been working in international development or sustainable development from the perspective of policymakers. So strong, people in positions of strength, leaders of countries in developing world, and thinking about people who are sort of setting the policy agenda. And one of my reflections as I was considering what to discuss today was realizing just how infrequently in practice in those places where these important decisions are being made by the strong, are the weak even ever identified really explicitly? Who are the weak or who are the vulnerable in the context of a policy that we might be discussing, a development policy or others? And how will what it is we are discussing affect the people who are the most vulnerable? And it suddenly occurred to me that if that question is not really even routinely considered, it sometimes is, but if it's not routinely considered, how are we likely to be safeguarding principles of integral human development in whatever language we use? And it leads us to ask the question, should that actually be the way that things are going forward, and what are the likely consequences? So what I would like to do is shift for just a moment from some of the more conceptual discussion and some of the discussion that I can imagine an economist will have in a couple of minutes, and pause for what's always a little bit of a dangerous thing to do in the academy, but I thought might be an interesting kind of thought experiment to illustrate this point in this context, and look at a little bit of a kind of a natural experiment. What does it look like in a place where these principles of integral human development, where either are or aren't respected by people in power, by the strong, in different places, in the same place at the same time? And how might the results of those perspectives look a little different in practice? So I thought a little case study might be interesting. Many of you know Nigeria, and I thought since Nigeria seems to feature prominently in most introductions about me, I thought maybe a few moments on Nigeria might be interesting. Quickly, as many of you know, largest population in Africa, largest economy in Africa, incredibly diverse country, about half the population of the United States living in an area the size of Texas, very heavily oil-based economy for export earnings, so 85% of government budget is funded by oil. The economy itself is much more diverse than that. And a real federation, lots of different states, 36 different states where governors are super powerful. So it helps us to be able to say which governors are and are not, or which parts of government are and are not thinking about these principles of integral human development and putting people at the center. And very big regional differences in terms of development as well. Generally speaking, I thought it would be illustrative to sort of show some of the, so darker is more developed and lighter is less developed. This is broken down by state. And you can see there's a pretty, there's a sort of a north-south divide that is reasonably stark. Some of you may be aware that in addition to what's going on in Nigeria in general, there's an insurgency that's going on in the northeast. Boko Haram, many of you heard of Boko Haram. This is a slide that shows the per capita GDP, so that how well off economic development, if you will, by the states that are somewhat impacted by Boko Haram in the northeast. And you can sort of see where they fit compared to the Nigeria average and how that changes over time. So the news isn't great. They make a little bit of progress, and then they kind of, things start falling apart. Just a little bit of a preview on the timeline. Nigeria during this period of sort of 2005 to 2015, 17 was very focused on achieving the Millennium Development Goals at the national level and put a lot of energy behind it. But at a practical level, at a local level, it didn't always work out as planned, and this was the part of the country that was most severely impacted. So not great news. Here's a health indicator. Sometimes we like to look at not just the whole aggregate what's going on in development, but let's look at a specific how many kids under 1 are immunized, which is something that we look at as kind of a proxy for how well the health system is doing. And you see, again, the big regional variations. But here we start seeing some pretty good news from the country as a whole. We see the under 5 child survival rate goes up and up and up. So the mortality rate for under 5 kids goes down, down, down over time. Similarly, maternal mortality goes down, down, down. So what's going on in a country where you have one part of the region, one part region exploding, literally, and the country overall actually meeting some pretty interesting development objectives. And what I would conjecture is this is an interesting time for us to consider whether integral human development and the principles associated with it were or were not integrated into the leadership practices of those in power in the states in the Northeast, where we saw bad news happen, and in the country as a whole at the center, where we saw a heavy emphasis placed on achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And what I would like to propose, and we'll spend a little bit more time going into more details, is that without knowing it, at the center, the MDG's office essentially adopted integral human development as its guiding principles. It called itself pro-poor, and on all the documentations for the Millennium Development Goals office, there was sort of 2 phrases that were required to be on everything. One was, "We are pro-poor," and the other, believe it or not, was called "putting people first." That was the point of it all, putting people first. And when you have that simple premise of being pro-poor, looking out for the most vulnerable, and putting people first, required on all your documents as the premier kind of development institution or center in the country, what kind of impact that may have versus a place where, as many people, and we'll look at in a sec, where the leadership of some of these places in the Northeast was not particularly treating people as a relevant part of the process. The poor were not generally considered. It was sort of an aristocratic system, and at least for this particular period in time that preceded the rise of the Boko Haram terrorism situation in the Northeast, the leaders there were perceived as acting out of impunity with complete disregard for the welfare of the people that they were meant to be overseeing. And one of the things that was particularly chilling about this is it wasn't just the political leaders, but the traditional and religious leaders who had sort of spiritual credibility and authority and responsibility were perceived of as having acted with disregard for the welfare of the people as well, and out of personal self-interest. So we'll return to this slide in a second, but I thought a little bit of a compare and contrast might be interesting. First, a little bit of a background. Some of you, of course, may be familiar with Boko Haram and what's gone on in the Northeast, but just to give you a sense of how devastating this group has been up there, it applied for ISIS membership and was denied on the grounds of being too brutal. Now, that's a pretty tricky thing to pull off, right? How is that possible, right? One of the things that I found quite fascinating about this is I started working in Nigeria when I heard about Boko Haram, and we all knew it. And it was this little group of people who were following a guy called Muhammad Yusuf, who was basically out there in the markets in Maiduguri, the capital city of Borno, the big state where Boko Haram was headquartered, saying, this isn't right that you're so poor and no one's paying attention. Government's not supposed to be doing it this way. And your traditional and religious leaders aren't supposed to be doing it this way either. Something's gone wrong, and you're not being treated properly. And that message really resonated with people, right? Because, of course, he was right. Now, he blamed Western education. He said, oh, they go off and they get educated as Westerners, and they come back and they become corrupt and poor servants of you and of God and of everybody else. So I don't want to oversell the virtues of the man, but his fundamental points were appealing for reasons that I think would be appealing to most anybody. And unlike many terrorist organizations where we don't see as much of a correlation with absolute poverty and with absolute development as some people might assert, with Boko Haram we do. They came from very, 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 very poor places. You saw the poverty numbers in these corners. And so when I was first going there, Boko Haram, we knew that they were following this man. And he had been arrested and was killed in police custody, or died mysteriously in police custody along with his brother-in-law. And this was like 2007, 2008. And we vaguely knew that there were some protests going on because people were pretty upset. They wanted justice. They still weren't out in the streets committing any violence, but they wanted justice because their leader had been killed. And the leadership up there, the governor said, we don't have to pay attention to what you have to say. Nah, we don't care that that's what you want. You don't matter. The most fundamental way, we can kill your leader. You can say that all you want is justice. You're not even saying we want the things he was complaining about. We're gonna just ignore what you have to say. And people got increasingly upset about this. And so they started a little campaign of saying, we're gonna go after the police, and we're gonna target the governor, and we're gonna target a few other people who were directly responsible for killing our voice. Literally. And for several years, that's what Boko Haram was. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, we hear that they've blown up the UN headquarters building in ways that look nothing like what we thought. And none of us thought it could possibly be Boko Haram because that's not the way that they acted. Turns out it was. And they were determined, it's a little bit of a side note, but I think you might appreciate it, they were determined to start a religious war in Nigeria. That was their goal, to set up a kind of a caliphate and start a religious war. And there were two men who basically stood there and said, no, this will not pass. Almost like Gandalf on the bridge, if you've seen that, no. And those two people were the Sultan of Sokoto, who is the top religious leader of the Muslims in the Hausa Fulani North, and the Cardinal, Onyaikan, who many of you know. And those two men together are credited with having stopped the brutality from spreading into a religious war. But Boko Haram was pretty determined that they were going to try to make this happen. And they ended up getting a lot of help from Gaddafi weapons and from al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, so they got some external support, and they got a lot of internal support from bands of people who were hired, frankly, to foment what should look like Christian-Muslim conflicts in political disputes. And they were a little bit unemployed because things had quieted down in the Middle Belt where there had been some of these disputes. And so they went up and they became basically the muscle of Boko Haram. And these men stopped it from spreading, but what it meant was Boko Haram got more and more and more and more and more brutal to try to force a reaction that these men stopped. And when they realized they weren't going to be able, no matter how many churches they blew up on a Sunday, they were not going to be able to make this spread, they concentrated that brutality in the places where they could control the land, in Borno State. Now, I want to pause for a moment and say, at almost every step along the way, almost any step along the way, if almost any of the principles of integral human development had been applied by people in leadership, this thing never would have become the Boko Haram that we know. If the people had been treated with a modicum of dignity and given some access to education and housing and food and things like that, there wouldn't have been cause for the protests in the first place. If the leaders had treated Muhammad Yusuf with a modicum, if they hadn't killed him, Boko Haram could not have arisen. If, when people demanded justice, someone had listened to them and treated them with dignity, it wouldn't have risen. We could probably go and find at almost any point, if you had chosen almost any aspect of integral human development and or human dignity, and treated people, this whole terrorist organization probably couldn't have arisen. And it's not just my opinion. I've sort of spoken with the governor there now. We've spoken with lots of leaders, and they sort of concur. This was an eminently preventable thing. In fact, it almost took an explicit commitment to destroying the concept of human dignity in every way for this to arise and become what it was. Simultaneously, so what does that all mean in terms of impacts? You can see some of the slides. But at a basic level, in Borno State, the main state where this was happening, there are more than 50,000 orphans. About a third of the housing stock's been destroyed. 1,000 schools have been blown up. Thousands of teachers have been killed. The majority of hospitals and health clinics have been destroyed. And one of the things that I thought might be interesting, you can see the internally displaced people, refugees, right, internal refugees. That's out of a number of 2.5 million, right? So there are about 2 million people internally displaced. So this has really just been a brutality that's mind-boggling. The results of this routine ignoring at so many different stages of integral human development. And I don't want to oversimplify, there were other things going on, but the point is there were solutions that presented themselves every step along the way, or even not, that could have prevented this. And they were not taken, and this is what Borno ended up with as a result, right? At the same time, in the same country, and sometimes even physically in the same place, because the Northeast was one of the places that was covered. This other office that I've been describing was adopting the principles of integral human development, though they didn't call it that. They didn't know that was the name. But putting people first, that's what this is, right? They did exactly the opposite. They said, we're going to put the dignity of the human person at the center of our program. And they became pro-poor. And every time we would have and I was working with this program at the time, every time we would have big meetings, this question of the dignity of the poorest, who are the poorest, how are they being affected, how is their dignity being effective, was front and center in what we were considering. Now, I cannot draw or pretend to draw an academically rigorous cause and effect relationship. But I think this stuff is really quite important. These are the kinds of documents that were sort of shown that would have that stuff on there. They set up a conditional grant scheme, it was called, to try to basically meet the Millennium Development Goals, cut poverty in half, achieve universal primary education, cut child mortality rates in half, maternal mortality rates in half across Nigeria. They set up plans to do that. And we used all kinds of fancy instruments. Some of you are thinking, wait, in Nigeria? How is that going to be possible? How can you get stuff like that done in Nigeria? It's a tricky place to get stuff done. Well, you're absolutely right, a very tricky place to get stuff done. It's especially a tricky place to get stuff done at scale. We used some fun technology. This is a land area that's the equivalent of a county in the United States. They're called LGAs in Nigeria, and we went and we surveyed each of the health facilities, every single health facility, education facility, and many community water points, one by one. We used fancy technology to be able to get pictures of them and to be able to get information and survey and have it all on a map so we could sort of see at the center where we should invest money and where we shouldn't. I won't belabor you the details, but essentially we came up with, for each of the Millennium Development Goals, what should the target be in order to achieve the goal? What did our baseline data show these counties were at, and what was the gap that needed to be filled? And then our work was filling the gap. So what happened with this program? Again, exactly the same years. It's the same geography, many of the same states. Instead of, and this is only kind of partway through, 50,000 discrete projects, and a discrete project be building a new school or rehabilitating a school or building a health clinic or rehabilitating a health clinic or creating a functioning water point across big chunks of Nigeria. And this is an ongoing program now. So really a sort of starkly opposite effect, right? Whoops, let me go back now. A starkly opposite effect. On the one hand, you end up with a situation where, teachers and schools are being blown up. On the other hand, we built 30,000 new schools and staffed them. On one hand, you have the child immunization rate basically rounding to zero as everything ground to a halt, and you start seeing child mortality rates going up and up and up and up, right? It's very sobering to see teeny little coffins that are totally preventable lined up one next to the other because of choices that we've made. On the other hand, you see the number of children, I want to emphasize this again, achieved in Nigeria during this period with very reliable data, DHS data for those of you who want to know. You see cutting in half the number of children under 5 dying every year, from 200 from 1 in 5 to fewer than 1 in 10. These are choices. And I don't want to oversimplify by suggesting that the only explanation for this is adopting principles of integral human development, human dignity, respect for the human person. But I will tell you, without doubt, that in one case, leadership clearly emphasized it, and in another case, they clearly dismissed it. And I believe that that made a pretty big difference. And when we ask these same questions for people in leadership at the time and observers, they'll say the same. Now, the question about why this matters, I mean, instinctively we know that integral human development is a virtue for all kinds of reasons, right? But understanding kind of some of the reasons why, or some of the consequences, or potential consequences of disregarding this, and the kind of hell on earth that it can lead to, I think helps us understand a lot more about what our responsibilities might be as the strong in our own lives, and however we may find ourselves, and also in our professional lives. A lot of the conditions that the Mohammed Yusuf was complaining about, including the impunity of local leadership, are happening across the Sahel, across big swaths of Africa now. Will another Boko Haram be allowed to rise, called something else, doing something else, or will we learn some lessons? And will we start taking some of the principles of human dignity and explaining to some local leadership why they're important and what might happen if you disregard them? And as we think about a program that in a very tricky country can figure out how to cut in half a child mortality rate, are we going to adopt those principles proactively as a global community? Or are we going to take that knowledge and let it sort of wither on the vine? We don't always know for things as profound as the dignity of every individual person or being created in the likeness of God. We don't always know for sure the consequences of respecting and implementing and loving those learnings. But I think sometimes we get hints. And at least for me, I can read a lot of the data and put up lots of aggregate charts, which actually was the first version of this presentation. But I thought maybe telling a story, illustrating just how stark the difference can be between putting people at the center of your thinking, wherever it is that you're strong, and putting the weak in particular in the forefront of your thoughts. Some version of the difference between the heaven that can create and the hell that can happen when you don't is worth keeping in mind. And I thought I would close with a quote many of you may recognize from a person some of you may recognize that I thought kind of aptly sums up the principle I was trying to illustrate. But if we don't want to look to Laudato Si as one of the sources, then we can look to Matthew 25 and recall that, Jesus' last words to us were to remember the least of these, and that our whole lives are going to be judged based on how well we consider them in all the forms with which they make themselves known to us as we go about our lives in this imperfect but beautiful world. So thank you very much for your time, and thank you, sir, for the many lessons you have spoken.
Dr. Barrett.
Thank you. It's a tall order to follow the preceding two speakers, especially with 2 seconds left in the session. But it's a great honor to get to be here. I thank the organizers for inviting my participation, and Holly for your moderating the panel, and the two of you for really fascinating comments. I'd like to give you a brief version of an economist's perspective on human flourishing. And I term this a progressive economic perspective for 2 reasons, as I'll explain in just a moment. The first is that I'm going to argue, and I doubt it requires much argument in this audience, that we need to embrace a preferential option for the poor. What is perhaps a more provocative argument is that I'm going to claim a lot of the economics community actually fully accepts that premise. And that's a foundational premise behind what I term progressive economics. Second part of being progressive, however, is recognizing that we can promote and we need to celebrate progress where it occurs, and it's indeed occurring all around us. And it's important to acknowledge and celebrate the progress the world has been enjoying, because it's the source of hope and the source of confidence that we can attack and solve the sorts of problems you've just heard described. Indeed, Sarah gives us a wonderful case study where the problems are not getting solved universally, but it is feasible to address the very real suffering humans face unnecessarily if we set our minds to it, if we deploy technologies, if we build relationships that make that work. And I'm going to then go on to emphasize what I term the 3 E's that are essential to human flourishing: empowering the poor, building their entitlements, by which I mean the Amartya Sen concept Archbishop Tomasi invoked Sen, of the capability people have to command a standard of living that is adequate based on what they own, on the rights that they have, etc. And finally, and relatedly, to facilitate exchange. And this is where human relationships become so essential, and where diversity is so essential. It is only when we are in relationship with people who are different from us that we can enjoy what we economists call gains from trade. If everybody is exactly like me, there is no gain from trade available. But it's precisely the diversity of our communities. And I'll show you a simple graphic. This is true in nature, and it's true in society. We need diversity as a source of strength. This endows us with comparative advantage. Exchange, voluntary exchange through community, through relationship, then becomes a central instrument of human flourishing. So let me just start with one slide that explains the economist's perspective of the preferential option for the poor. This is my favorite sentence in the entire literature of economics. It's the opening sentence of the Nobel Prize acceptance speech of Ted Schultz back in 1979. And I think it's important to underscore that the opening sentence of a Nobel Prize acceptance speech tells us something about what is being emphasized. And Schultz wrote, most of the people in the world are poor, so if we knew the economics of being poor, we would know much of the economics that really matters. And the highlighted part in red is actually the title of the blog that my graduate students and postdocs run at Cornell, Economics That Really Matters. And it's all about the lives and experiences of the poor and what we can do to improve their standards of living. So the second part of being progressive is recognizing and celebrating progress. And I'm going to show you a few slides very quickly here. I'm not going to go into detail on any of them. And I commend to you the Oxford-based group Our World in Data, from which I take every one of these slides, so shout out to them. But it's important to recognize that 200 years ago, virtually nobody lived with democratic freedoms. Today, the large majority of the world's population lives with democratic freedoms, and virtually nobody is a colonist. Virtually nobody lives under colonial rule of some foreign distant power. So we see dramatic progress in the political freedoms we enjoy, which are, after all, essential to empowering the least powerful among us, the vulnerable. Sarah referred to people who are voiceless. Democracy is a deeply imperfect instrument, but as Churchill said, it's the best of the bad options available to us. We see progress in terms of reduced deaths from conflict. Sarah described a really brutal conflict that has been taking place in northeast Nigeria and in surrounding areas of neighboring countries, I would add. And it is important to recognize and decry and to combat violence in all its forms. But we're actually seeing progress. We are today, in historic terms, near all-time record lows in rates of violent death in conflict, of military and civilian. And compared to just within the lifetimes of many of in this audience, we've seen remarkable drops in the rates of human death from violence. We see dramatic progress in child mortality. This plots the distribution across the world of child mortality rates. The graphic, the top curve in red, is the global distribution of child mortality rates in the 1800s. And it's hard to imagine 1 out of 3 children dying, but that was the norm. Not really that long ago. Indeed, when I was born, the child mortality rate in the United States is exactly the same as today's child mortality rate in Nepal. We've seen remarkable progress worldwide. We still see unnecessarily high child mortality rates and maternal mortality rates in many parts of the world, but the progress here in short order is nothing short of remarkable. It is doable. We can reduce child deaths still further. We see rising education around the world, rising literacy rates. We've gone from 1 in 8 people were literate to only 1 in 8 people are illiterate in a relatively short time span. We see incredibly rapid rates in life expectancy. Notice the curves on the far lower right for places like Ethiopia, which Archbishop Tomasi knows well. We're seeing increases in human longevity that are remarkable and at a somewhat basic arithmetic level, directly a product of improved child survival. When you you survive your preschool years, you're much more likely to have a high longevity. We've seen dramatic reductions in extreme poverty around the world, especially over the last couple of generations. The transition in China is nothing short of remarkable. It doesn't come without its own problems, but the real resolution of grinding poverty, of mass starvation, is something we need to celebrate and that we can replicate. And the crucial part of recognizing and celebrating progress is it means that we know we can replicate this. And let me give you one closing example on progress, and that is deaths from natural disasters. I want to flag for you in the 1920s. You see that there's a large blue space, I think it appears on this graphic, of deaths associated with droughts. And now look at the rightmost bar, the most current data. Basically, nobody dies from drought-related emergencies today. And the reasons for that are improvements in institutions, that we have private voluntary organizations that have become incredibly effective at humanitarian response, especially to slow onset disasters, as we term them, like droughts. Floods, earthquakes, things like that hit very quickly, and we still have a hard time protecting people. Droughts, we have advance warning, and we've basically solved the most egregious problem of droughts, which is people dying from them, the way that Steinbeck described in this country less than 100 years ago. The progress in institutions, in communications, in financial instruments to solve drought problems is really remarkable, and it's the sort of thing that encourages us, because we can't stop the rain from not falling, but we can stop people from dying when the rain doesn't fall. And that's a really crucial bit of progress. The caution is we need to beware of growing complacent. The greatest example of this I can think of is the complacency in the global food system. Many of you are aware that in the late 1960s, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to, of all people, a plant breeder, Norman Borlaug, who was credited with sparking the Green Revolution, the tremendous scientific revolution in plant genetic material that averted mass starvation in the face of rapid population growth. So Borlaug was credited with keeping 1 billion people alive through better crop production. And the successes of the Green Revolution induced governments around the world to dramatically reduce their investments in agricultural research and development and extension. But the thing about an agricultural system as an ecosystem is that the pressures, the pathogens, the pests are constantly evolving. If you do not keep up the research, you will fall behind. It's essentially a treadmill system. You've got to be running in order to stay in place. And the failure to invest in agricultural research, development, and extension through the 70s and 80s in the wake of the great successes of the Green Revolution led to declining productivity rates and ultimately to the price spikes that we saw earlier in in 2007-8 and 2011-12, leading to violence, food riots, and a sharp increase in poverty and malnutrition, ultimately due to complacency about combating the challenge of adequate food production to ensure everybody is adequately nourished. Moreover, the challenges we face today are a little bit tougher. It's relatively challenging to take care of places like Sarah just described to you. Nature doesn't treat them well, there's unreliable rainfall, the soils are relatively poor in quality, the state hasn't done a good job, they don't provide good roads, they don't provide reliable police protection. There are a whole host of confluences that combine to mean that where poverty exists today, it's increasingly concentrated in space. We see this primarily today in sub-Saharan Africa. Just 25 years ago, only about a quarter of the world's ultra-poor, those who live at half of the extreme poverty line, so 90 cents per person per day, only about a quarter of them lived in Africa. Today, more than 80% live in sub-Saharan Africa. This is where we find the world's most pressing, most complex emergencies, and I use the term complex emergencies quite intentionally because violence is a common part of the emergencies we face that manifest in extreme poverty. So places like northeastern Nigeria, places like Somalia, South Sudan, Yemen, the 4 locations that have been declared in famine or near famine by the United Nations, the first time since the United Nations creation, we've had 4 different famine or near famine conditions in the world. So the challenges are increasingly complicated, increasingly spatially concentrated, increasingly remote, but they are still doable. They're doable when we empower the poor. The core problem is these places are in what we sometimes term poverty traps, places where the poor have a hard time accelerating their own investment and development, so they become, quite tragically and ironically, agents of their own poverty. Their own behaviors, which are appropriate behaviors in their context, wind up just continuing the immiseration of their families. And there are a lot of different mechanisms behind this. I have an entire book coming out this year on the economics of poverty traps. But the key principle is it takes money to make money. Very poor people can't afford a good diet for their children. They can't afford to send their children to school. They have to send them off to work instead. They're suffering stress that we know manifests itself in elevated cortisol levels that impede their productivity and their cognitive function. There are a lot of different mechanisms behind this, but the core thing is poverty begets poverty. And we have to enhance the entitlements of the poor, their ability to secure their own and their children's future safely and reliably. And we know from lots of evidence now that that actually induces investments and the sorts of rapid exits from poverty we saw in those macro numbers I showed. So what is the key entitlement people need? It's their labor power. This is why slavery is the most egregious of all sins in human society, because to deny people the ability to control their own time, their labor power, their thought, is to deprive them of the one asset that even the landless have. If you have no bank account, if you have no land, no vehicles, no livestock, but you at least control your own labor power, you have the possibility of being able to work yourself to a better condition. And the labor productivity of the poor is the most essential thing that we need to address. And this fits very nicely with the integral human development concept because it's all about education. It's about health. It's about nutrition. It's about relationships. People's ability to be productive because they have the freedoms and the talent and the physical and cognitive potential, as well as the relationships to flourish and realize their full God-given potential. We have to promote the poor's access. Once you give them the freedoms, and the basic production ability, the basic assets, including human capital, to generate a reasonable standard of living for themselves, you have to give them the ability to turn that into something else, to express their desires, to enjoy culture, to express their desire to read books through exchange. None of us can produce everything that we wish to consume. That's why trade is so important. But that requires markets to work effectively and fairly. When markets are controlled by powerful individuals exercising monopoly powers, people cannot get ahead because all the gains from trade are extracted by the powerful. We need people to be able to exchange across time through finance. That's what finance is. It's trading savings today for spending tomorrow, or borrowing today for repayment tomorrow, or a premium payment today for an insurance payout someday in the future when something bad happens. Finance is giving us the ability to make exchanges across time and across people. So access to finance, access to technologies like the Green Revolution technologies for small farmers, access to safety nets that protect them in the event of misfortune, these are the essential things to empower the poor to really flourish. And technology is really at the heart of this. The one quibble I have with Laudato Si', which is a document I love and treasure, is it conveys to people sometimes a mistaken fear of technology. But technology is deeply empowering for the poor. I've never met a farmer in rural Africa. Most of my work is in remote areas of rural Africa. I've never met a farmer who doesn't want better seed, who wouldn't welcome having some machinery, wouldn't welcome having access to irrigation or other forms of technology. And we have good evidence that simple technologies like mobile banking applications on one's phone, a brilliant study done by economists at MIT and Georgetown last year could put a number on it for us, that one technology, one platform in one place in Kenya brought nearly 200,000 households out of extreme poverty. That's a remarkable number for a single localized technology. This is doable. Technology is our friend. We have to be careful about the use of technologies inappropriately, but we need to promote the access of the poor to technologies that can help them. And finally, I want to emphasize the important role of diversity, because exchange is ultimately how people get ahead. We cannot produce everything we need. Diversity is an asset, is a blessing, is a source of productivity in nature. This is a simple graphic from a paper a few of us published last year, or now 2 years ago, 2016, in Science, that shows the relationship between biodiversity, tree species diversity, and the productivity of forests around the world. And notice that this is a steadily increasing at decreasing rates, but a steadily increasing function of the diversity of a forest. As forests go, so go people. we do better in diverse communities. And the key here is community in two different forms. The first is community that integrates us, that allows us to interact with one another. That's important for preventing violence. Some of you may be aware the Fulbright Scholarship Program, named after Bill Fulbright, a former senator from Arkansas, who was so horrified by the ravages of World War II and then Korea that he set about creating a set of bilateral exchange programs so that leading young people from the United States and other countries would get to know one another's culture. They would build relationships, they would build friendships, and his underlying hypothesis was, if we build those relationships, we will never go to World War again. That was the fundamental premise of the Fulbright Scholarship. That's community. Community is also there for gains from trade, from exchange, but it's essential also that it be about solidarity, that we stand with the poor. Because many changes that we make, whether it's new technologies, Archbishop Tomasi referred to robots. Robots will take some people's jobs. We have to make sure that we can credibly commit to protect the well-being of those who might lose from change, whether it's technological change or policy change like trade liberalization that will put a few people out of work. You have to make sure that they don't suffer, that the aggregate gains truly get shared universally. That's part of community. Immigration, I would argue, is the single biggest example of this, that we all stand to benefit from diversity, but we've got to do so in a way that ensures everybody benefits. So let me just close by remarking that there's been phenomenal progress in the world. In my lifetime, the progress in human flourishing is demonstrable across a lot of different indicators. It's something we need to celebrate, something we need to focus on because it underscores the potential we have to permanently eradicate extreme poverty in all its forms in the world within a generation. This is feasible, but it's not easy. And the places where we have to combat this now are the places where it is hardest to get the job done. But a central piece of combating poverty in its most egregious forms and promoting human flourishing is to promote human relationships and community, solidarity, integration, exchange, and a healthy appreciation for the many benefits we enjoy from diversity. These are foundational concepts in economics. As much as some non-economists might struggle to believe it, these are things that economists celebrate. We celebrate diversity, we celebrate integration, and we do, as Ted Schultz articulated in his opening sentence, believe in a preferential option for the poor. These are tremendous opportunities to advance human flourishing. The sort of community we have here has the opportunity to do so. Thank you very much.
As you know, we are way over time, no time for questions, and we'll leave with those words. Thank you.